I was only 19 when this happened to me. It was back in the early fall of 1981, when I was spending a lot of my time working. When I was 19, I lived outside of Fayetteville, not too far, about 30 or so miles away in a small town known to many as Siloam Springs. Because of the job I worked at, it would require me to pull later shifts since I would usually be covering more than just my job. I had a good-for-nothing boss at the time who insisted that it saved the company more money by throwing their employees with bigger tasks and workloads, but no overtime pay. But that's a story for another day. One evening, I was driving back home outside of Fayetteville along Highway 68. I'm probably on the road for no more than a couple of minutes before my eyes catch something. This tall figure walking alongside the road about 50 feet away from the car. As I pull closer to it, I can see that this looked to be someone in an elaborate Werewolf in London costume from way back. Why would they be wandering the side of the road out here? I thought the whole thing was strange, but then I got closer, and what I thought to be a person actually turned its head. I realized in that moment, it wasn't just somebody having a convincing werewolf costume party. If there was ever a living werewolf, this was it. I just remember how scary its face looked. I think my headlights caught its attention, because as it turned around, it also lifted up its arm, as if to shield its eyes from the light. After standing there for a second, it quickly vanished off the road on the same side it was on. Freaked me the hell out. I had seen enough to know that it was not a person. A person doesn't act like that in a costume, or move like that. I could tell even in the poor lighting, its fur had to be thick, it was long and stringly. Think of a long-haired fluffy dog, I guess. I'm not sure how to explain it. It had a longer snout, but the upper part of its face is what I think was more fierce looking. It just had an angry expression. You know how dogs can look when they're happy, or even when they're mad? It was the same kind of thing. It just seemed to have a scowl on its face. I saw it for what felt like an eternity, but it did raise up its arm fairly quickly to shield its eyes from my headlights. When I had seen it, I came down almost to a stop to cruise and to try to figure out what it was I was looking at. Never in all my years have I ever seen such a thing. I know about Bigfoots, but I don't know what it is I encountered that night. Back in the early 80s, I had went fishing with a couple of buddies out in a lake that was adjacent to the Mississippi River. I believe the year was either 84 or 85. This was also near the town of Hughes, not far off from Highway 147. The lay of the land is thick with brush and forest, intermixed with cypress and pine. It's a beautiful wetland area. We were exploring the area and hiking around along the lakes and areas near the large river. It was nearing sundown, and we still had a ways to go to get back to where we had come from. We all heard this loud crashing sound near the bank of the river and the thick foliage and undergrowth. We weren't sure if it could have possibly been a stray cow or maybe another fisherman perhaps. All of a sudden, we see this thing that was shaped like a person appear out of the foliage just feet from the edge of the water. It looked just like a dog standing up on two legs. It had thick matted hair, and its head was disproportionately large. I still remember those large pointed ears. I don't know why, how, who, or what, but by the grace of God Almighty, it didn't notice us, somehow. After maybe a second of appearing out of the foliage, it lifted its head up in the air and sniffed around just like how a dog does. Then it looked off in the opposite direction we were and jumped full body into the river. All three of us were shocked but amazed by what we had just seen. My one friend kept trying to tell me it was just a bear, but it was definitely canine looking, no doubt about that. From the distance we were at too, I would say it was at least as tall as we were. It even had a thin, tapered waist like a dog, and dog-like legs. It was eerie. I don't think there's any native wild dogs that walk upright in this area, but I guess I'm wrong. I know I've heard people talk about strange things that happen near the river and in the woods, but I always just thought it was more hoaxes and BSing. Anyway, the entirety of the encounter lasted maybe 20 seconds in total. I feel like that's being pretty gracious. Maybe more like 10 to 15 seconds. I should state that we didn't smell anything unusual in that moment, or before or after the incident. Never got any weird feelings, experienced anything weird or anything unusual. It was just when we heard that crashing sound that we saw this thing. We were about 100 plus feet away from it, but where it was at, we had a clear as day view of this thing. Even in dusk, there was enough light to make out vivid details. Late summer, back in 2009, I was visiting family that lived outside of Memphis in the evening time. I was driving in the truck with my brothers and cousins from my dad's side of the family. We were heading to their property to go feed the horses and livestock. It was a longer drive. We ended up having to take a small dirt road that went quite a ways off the main road for quite some distance. Just like out of a horror movie, my brothers get a call from their mom, who's at the house, to just see where they were. They got her on speakerphone, and they're having casual conversation for the most part. Then they start talking about how the horses have acted really spooked all day long and are acting strange. My brothers say that they have noticed that too, and they're not sure why, since that hardly if ever happens. I kid you not even a couple minutes later, this freak of nature looking dog thing steps out across the road, looks at our vehicle, and quickly darts into the woods. All of us were screaming, "Did you see that?" My stepmom was still on the phone with my brothers, and we're all freaking out. Whatever it was had long, brown, shaggy hair, a massive dog head with lots of teeth and huge claws on its hands. I distinctly remember it tucking its arms and hands up to its body, like a T-Rex does when it ran across the road. I also vividly recall it having long 12-inch black claws off each of its fingertips. For whatever reason, my eyes went right to its hands. Maybe because it looked so terrifying. The hands reminded me a lot of raccoon hands, actually, just with really long, large claws. I briefly saw the face, but it happened so fast, I think I just spent more time taking it all in. After more freaking out and trying to make sense of it, I almost wonder if that's what had caused the horses to act up. They only lived a couple of miles away from the spot we saw this thing. They had been acting up all morning long, and then that happened in the evening. When it crossed the road, it seemed to come from the general direction of our house, so I wouldn't be surprised if that was the case. I have truly no idea, though. I do remember that evening, the horses seemed to be a little more calmed down, and the following day, they were okay. I don't think any of us could really put a finger on exactly what it was we saw, but my brothers say it was an alien dog or something. It just looked like a big, upright, hairy wolf dog. I've thought about the whole werewolf thing too, but I don't know. Werewolves are usually painted in a much more human-like light than this thing was. It was just full-on wild animal. You could tell by the way it looked and moved. Very humanoid looking, but like a wild beast. I do recall seeing its hair blowing a little bit in the wind as it dove across the road after seeing us. From what I can remember about seeing the body, it was very lean. There were muscles rippling by where its front of its body was, like the chest and stomach. I remember that. I know for a fact that this was not a bear, wolf, regular dog, coyote, nothing that I've ever seen before. That's the weirdest thing. Even though it looked very dog-like, it didn't look exactly like just a dog standing there. Like I said, it was very humanoid and looked like its own being. Its face, from what I remember, was more wolf-like in appearance, but still very dog-like. I want to say that I'm being honest and sharing this sensitive information. I know there's a lot of people I could just openly tell this story to because I would be mocked and criticized for such things. I'm here to tell you there are things beyond our imagination that we don't know about living out there. I was a pretty big skeptic of things too, that I didn't normally or couldn't normally see with my own eyes. I used to believe that if there were any unknown species of anything living in North America, especially the woods, we would know by now due to our dense population and a technology of exploration. I guess I was wrong and can happily admit that. I was on a cross-country trip with my 13-year-old son some years back. We were headed to a hotel and were currently in Arkansas at the time. It was nighttime and we were lost and both of our phones were dead, so we were kind of just driving around aimlessly. I can't tell you the exact road we were on because I don't remember. I can tell you we were somewhere close to Highway 27, as that is the last road I remember. I also remember us being on a 2-lane highway and my son complaining that he had to pee real bad, so we pulled over. There is thick forest around us, and especially where I pulled off to, so I figured it would be the perfect spot for him to run up into the trees and relieve himself. Using his phone as a flashlight, he wandered off about 20 feet just into the tree line. I'm sitting there in the car, checking my phone to see if I can get anything, and I hear what sounds like footsteps sprinting to my car. I turn my head to look over and my son's frantically opening the door, jumping in and screaming at me to go, go, go. He's yelling and being crazy, and I'm trying to calmly talk to him and figure out what just happened, and he starts getting really emotional and begging me to go and not explaining anything. This was out of character for my son. He never acted like this. My son, by nature, is very quiet and collective. He's a good boy, and he's been out with me on all sorts of adventures. He's definitely not a scaredy cat. In fact, when he was younger, he's the one who decided to stick his whole arm in an ant mound, but that's a different story. Something spooked him this time, so bad that he was totally acting weird. So I pulled out of there, and we're driving down the road, and I'm trying to figure out if he even got to use the bathroom. He doesn't even acknowledge the question, and instead just tells me there was a big wolf that he had ran into in the tree line. What? When I asked him, what do you mean wolf? He said this thing was the size of a grizzly bear and standing on 2 legs. He said it stuck its hand out to try and grab him, but ended up turning around and ran back to the car just in time. The scariest thing he told me is, Dad, I'm 13 and I don't believe in monsters, but that was a real-life monster. I know many parents would blow their child off and tell them they probably just saw something that spooked them. I've raised my son to be very logical and analytical. I teach him to question everything, and I believe my son saw something because I even try to reassure him that maybe in the poor lighting, it was just a bear. He explains to me that because he was so close to this thing, he got a good look at it, or at least enough of a look at it, and said bears don't have teeth like this, Dad. Of course, this was years ago, and he is now 20. We just recently brought up this event again in conversation, and he goes, Dad, I guess what I seen that night is what they call a Dogman. I guess they are all over America, and I happened to see one. I asked him if they are like werewolves, and he said no, that they're just upright walking canine cryptids. I'm not too sure what I think about the whole thing, but it is interesting, and I thought you would like me to share it with you. I wanted to talk to you about a strange encounter I had years ago when I went turkey hunting down by the Mississippi River. I went with my brother, whom we grew up together, very close. A lot of brothers fight and end up being distant from one another. However, me and my brother grew up playing video games and enjoying the outdoors together. One of our favorite pastimes is to go fishing, so we got up early. This is probably about 4 or 5 in the morning if I recall correctly, and for whatever reason on this morning, we had forgot to bring any flashlights, so we were trying to track through the woods in the dark with all of our supplies. That's when we heard things that make this whole incident terrifying. Me and my brother are just a couple of feet away from each other, navigating our way when we begin to hear sounds like a stampede around us, going the opposite direction into the thick wilderness. I'm not kidding when I say stampede. It sounded like multiples of these big heavy animals trotting around us, maybe not even 20 feet away. When I tell people this, during this part of the story, they tell me it was probably a bunch of bucks. But I'm here to tell you I know what a quadruped animal sounds like. This wasn't it. I have heard deer run many times, and this did not sound like it. It didn't sound like hooves. And when I say run, I'm talking about people. It sounded like multiple big heavy people were running all around us in the opposite direction we were going. Multiple people, maybe like 10. Very, very heavy footsteps. The noises that accompanied were equally terrifying. My brother and I were frozen still as this was going on, all the while hearing grunts and moans. Grunts that were very guttural. Reminded me of a lion's guttural growl almost. The whole thing had lasted 20 seconds, and then just like that, it was gone. I don't think we broke silence for maybe a minute or two after. My brother whispered, "What the hell was that?" I had no idea. I didn't even know what had just happened. We decided to screw the fishing trip right then and there and get back to the truck and go. The whole way back we were trying to make sense of what just happened and what kind of animal could even do that. We kept coming back to moose or bear or deer because it's the only thing that would or could make sense with how heavy this was, but we both agreed it didn't sound like something running on 4 legs. There's nothing in the woods that's heavy that runs on 2 legs. Very freaky to think about. And the growling? There's no animals we can pinpoint those noises to. This happened just last summer when I went horseback riding with a couple of friends. It was about 3 in the afternoon, and the sun was bright, and it was perfect weather outside. The horses we were riding were actually my friends. These were well behaved. They had a lot of human contact and were ridden a lot. In fact, I had ridden on these horses a couple of times before, but it had been at least a few months, so I was joyful to be back on such a peaceful, loving animal. My friend and his horses choose between 3 to 4 different trails that go along their property, all of them being several miles in length at one point or another loop around. My friend is lucky enough to have hundreds of acres that he had inherited through family and decided to use them for horseback riding and hunting. Beautiful, beautiful backcountry, I will say. We were riding along the trail, and we were in an area with thick forest on both sides of us, which is not too abnormal since most of the trail does have thick forest, but other parts of the trail were open and more rocky and mountainous. We were chatting amongst ourselves when suddenly my friend's horse directly in front of me starts freaking out. Not even 2 seconds later, both my horse and my other friend who owns the horses starts freaking out. The horses, they were acting skittish and out of control. We're trying to calm the horses down when we start hearing what sounds like trees being knocked over and smashed. This was so loud, and it wasn't far away from us. It just sounded like a massive bulldozer being driven through the woods, coming straight in our direction. But there was no machinery sound, nothing. Just the sound of something very large coming through and crashing through the woods. Whatever it was must have spooked the living hell out of our horses. I don't even think there was much communication other than just pure action and fight or flight. We all turned around in unison with our horses, trying to get them to go back the way we came. As we managed to get a hold of the horses enough to start going back in the direction we came, and I turned my head around behind me to see a large pair of canine-like ears poking through the forestry. As my brain scrambled to find an appropriate answer for what I'm seeing, I then noticed these glowing red eyes slightly lower than the ears, and realized we're being watched by something. Of course, the horses are moving relatively quickly now because they are so freaked out. Well, we all were because of the noise that is encroaching on us. We got out of there too fast for me to be able to properly discern what it was coming towards us. It didn't stop. I know for a fact I saw those large red eyes and the canine ears. It's kind of the same glow to the eyes that you would see in an eye shine when headlights hit eyes, but they were red. I have no explanation for the incredible and disastrous noises coming from the forest headed in our direction. The only thing I really know about that area is that it is really out there in the woods. There would be no reason for somebody else to be out there, since it's all private land. Due to the size and sounds that we heard, I really don't think it was a person. It could have been a large moose or something of that crashing size, but it was incredibly unsettling, and I'm not sure how to summarize the experience other than it freaked us all the hell out and made us very apprehensive about going back down that trail again. I don't know if you remember me. It's been months since I've written to you. A while back, I had traveled into the Arkansas Ozarks and found that dead black bear that was ripped to shreds. I'm sure you get a lot of stories sent to you, so hopefully you might remember mine. I might just have to try and dig up your episode with my story in it, but I digress. A few months ago, before all the quarantine craziness, I had traveled back into the Ozarks and was hiking around. I was actually searching for good streams to fish out of, and I was around the Richland Creek area, to be exact. I know there are bear in the area, and that's about the only large big animal that I'm familiar with. The area and terrain that I was in is very rocky, and I remember walking along the edge of the creek, looking down into the very soft gravel. I noticed tiny indents. Well, not tiny, but tiny as in large footprint, but with a very light indentation because of the gravel. My eyes followed it about 10 feet, and then right there, on the very edge of the creek, were some of the largest wolf tracks I've ever seen. Of course, the one time I don't bring my camera with me, I see something like this. The only thing I can personally compare them to is my own hand. It was easily double the size of my hand. Absolutely massive. It was without a doubt a canine track. I mean, canine prints are pretty distinctive, and they are hard to mistake. Normally, I would just suggest somebody had their dog out here, but I don't believe dogs get this big, of any breed. If I had to measure with my eyes, I would say in total it was maybe 14 and 15 inches in length, or from corner to corner, I guess. Anyway, just thought I would share that with you. This was back in February, when things were still very wet. I was visiting some friends down in Huntington, Arkansas, back in '91 for the summer. We decided to go to this neat little lake that was great for bass fishing. One thing you got to be careful about down there is water moccasins everywhere, and they will bite. So there I am, trudging along the bank of the lake, trying to watch every single step very carefully. That's when I started hearing commotion off to my left, when I turned my head and saw one of the largest creatures in my life staring at me, watching me. I've never been so afraid in my life. This thing looks like it came from the pits of hell. It was tall, standing on 2 feet, covered in dark black hair that almost looked to absorb light itself. It was so jet black. The eyes felt like they put me in a trance. These glowing red-orange orbs, or amber I guess you would call it. I've never felt such hate and malice off a being before. As soon as we locked eyes, I just felt that this thing was bad news, and if I stuck around, it was really going to hurt me. I knew not to run because I didn't know what this thing was. If it was a predator, I would only incite the chase if I ran. So I tried to back away slowly, which I did until it was entirely out of sight. It never followed me, just continued to watch me even as I moved away. As I backed further and further out, this thing kept its focus on the lake, as it was intently watching something in the water. I don't know what. When I made it back to my friends, they laughed at me, asking me why I was so pale and shaking. I knew in that moment if I told them what I'd seen, I'd be the laughing stock of the group for the day. So I just said I saw a big moccasin and nearly avoided it. I'm no horror movie fan, but sometimes when I've watched werewolf movies before, it really gives me the creeps, because they always remind me so much of what I saw that day. Not saying it was a werewolf, just that this thing and those things from the movies looked very similar. I believe what I saw was definitely more than an animal. When it and I locked eyes, I could tell there was intelligence in this being I was staring at, and it wasn't just a wild animal. It felt evil, but still very intelligent, if that makes any sense.